They say when you're sick, you find out who truly loves you. But when I got the results that would change my life forever, the man I loved was in someone else's kitchen, grating cheese over lasagna for his ex. Renan had never asked for much. He didn't like drama, didn't need grand gestures. All he ever wanted was for the person he built a home with to show up when it mattered, to stand beside him not just when life was easy, but when things got dark. And that day, they got darker than he ever imagined. The signs had been small at first. The tiredness that didn't go away, the light fever that kept returning, a sense that something wasn't quite right in his body. Renan booked the appointment alone, even though he had asked Hugo to come with him. It was important, but Hugo had waved it off, saying it was probably just stress or a seasonal thing. On the morning of the results, Renan didn't sleep. He lay in bed beside Hugo, staring at the ceiling. His mind ran in circles. What if it was nothing? What if it was everything? Hugo barely stirred. He had mentioned casually the night before that Lucas was going through a tough breakup, that he might swing by with some groceries, maybe cook something. Renan didn't ask questions. He never did, because he trusted him, because that's what love is supposed to be. The clinic was cold, sterile. Renan sat in a chair that squeaked under his weight, hands pressed together to stop the shaking. The doctor didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't need to. Renan had known, somehow, deep down, the moment the words HIV positive hit the air. He didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He just stared ahead, as if he were watching a movie he couldn't pause. He stepped out into the afternoon sun, blinking as if light could burn. He messaged Hugo. Once, then again, no answer. He didn't call his mother, didn't text a friend. Just sat on a bench outside the clinic, holding the printed paper like it was on fire. There was a number at the bottom for emotional support, but the only person Renan wanted to hear from was Hugo. Hours passed, evening came, the city lit up while he sat still, hollow. Then, finally, a message. Sorry, babe. Lucas had a rough one. I made dinner. On my way now. Now, want anything from the bakery? From the bakery. He had just learned he was HIV positive, and his partner of 5 years was asking if he wanted dessert. When Hugo walked through the door, it was as if nothing had happened. He placed a box of pastries on the table, smiled, and said, "You okay? You look tired." Renan didn't answer. He reached into his bag and handed Hugo the folded results. Hugo took them, read for a few seconds, then looked up, eyes wide. Not with fear, not with sympathy, but confusion. Wait, so you actually went to the appointment as if the surprise wasn't in the result, but in the fact that Renan followed through. There was no embrace, no, we'll get through this together. Just silence, and the faint smell of garlic and oregano still clinging to Hugo's sweater. That night, Renan lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling once again. But this time, he wasn't waiting for anything. He already knew. The man beside him was never going to choose him when it mattered most. And the truth, as bitter as the pills he'd now have to take every day, was that love, real love, doesn't leave you alone in a clinic while it cooks for someone else. Stay with us. Next part will show you what happened after Renan walked away from the one person he thought he could count on. Don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories for more true stories of love, betrayal, and healing that might just change the way you see your own. The morning after, Renan made coffee like he always did. 2 cups, one with honey, one with milk. The routine was muscle memory, but something about it felt wrong, like acting out a habit that didn't belong to him anymore. Hugo walked in yawning, kissed Renan on the cheek, then grabbed the cup meant for him without a word. No mention of what had happened the day before. No follow-up, no plan, just silence, as if the diagnosis was a small hiccup, an inconvenience to be swept under the rug. Renan watched him from across the kitchen. Hugo was humming while scrolling his phone, smiling at something someone had sent him. Then he paused, looked up, and said, "Lucas didn't sleep well, Megidan. I might go check on him tonight." He's just not coping. That sentence shattered the fragile thread of restraint Renan had been holding on to. He didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't ask. What about me? Because he already knew the answer. Hugo wasn't going to show up for him. Not really. Not emotionally, not consistently, and not when it counted. The fever came back that afternoon, low, dull, persistent. Renan lay on the couch with a blanket, scrolling through support forums, reading stories of people who'd gone through the same thing. There was comfort in their words. But there was also a recurring theme: healing doesn't begin with medicine. It begins with choosing yourself. He waited until late evening. Hugo still hadn't returned. Renan called his sister, asked if he could stay for a while. Didn't explain much, didn't have to. She just said, "Come, we'll make space." He packed lightly just what he needed: some clothes, medication, his laptop, and a single framed photo of him and Hugo from a beach trip years ago, before things got messy, before Lucas reappeared. The ride to his sister's was quiet. His phone buzzed once. A message from Hugo: "Made Lucas dinner. He's finally eating again. Be home soon." Want anything? Another offer for food. Another missed moment. Another silence between them, now impossible to fill. At his sister's, Renan collapsed into bed. He let himself cry. Not for the diagnosis, not even for the betrayal, but for the version of himself that had waited so long for someone to love him like he loved them. The next day, he went back to the clinic, not for another checkup, but to speak with a counselor. He needed answers, not just about his health, but about the timeline, about how and when the virus had entered his life. He recounted everything honestly: his history, his monogamy, his trust. And the counselor asked, gently, "When was your partner's last test?" Renan hesitated. He didn't know. They hadn't talked about it in years, because he thought they didn't need to. He went home that night with a knot in his stomach, not from the fever, but from the sudden, chilling question that echoed louder than anything. What if Hugo gave it to me? That thought buried itself in Renan's chest, and once it settled, it refused to leave. In that moment, he understood something painful but clear. He wasn't just heartbroken. He might have been deceived. And betrayal of the body cuts deeper than betrayal of the heart. What started as silence was becoming suspicion, and Renan knew he couldn't go back. Not yet. Some truths don't come crashing like thunder. They arrive quietly, like a thread you pull without meaning to, until the whole fabric of your life comes undone. Renan sat in the waiting room of the clinic again, not because he was sick, but because he needed clarity. He had told the counselor everything, every detail, every date, and she had listened carefully. Then she had asked a question he hadn't expected. "Would you like to know the estimated time of infection?" It wasn't a question many were prepared for, but Renan said yes. What followed wasn't a dramatic reveal. No music in the background, no trembling hands, just numbers, data, markers in the blood. The specialist explained it clinically, but Renan felt every word like it was hitting bone. Based on Renan's current viral load and test pattern, the infection had occurred recently, very recently. Too recent for it to be some distant mistake from years past. Too recent for it to be anything but someone else's truth slipping into his body without his permission. Renan sat in the hallway afterward, staring at the floor. There were no names written in the report, no arrows pointing to a villain, but the timeline was clear. And Hugo had disappeared for 3 days in the first week of the month. He said he was going to a meditation retreat with a friend, said he needed to clear his head. Renan hadn't asked questions because he trusted him, because that's what people in love do. Now, with the numbers in hand, he couldn't ignore what they were trying to say. That night, Renan went home to his sister's apartment and opened an old journal. He flipped back to the start of the year. He traced Hugo's schedule, the dinners with Lucas, the unannounced absences, the changed passwords on his laptop. Things that once felt like small quirks now stood out like red flags. He remembered something else. Lucas had been sick around the same time, a flu that wouldn't go away, a mysterious fatigue. Renan had even made soup and sent it over, because that's the kind of partner he was: thoughtful, giving, hopeful. He remembered Hugo thanking him and saying something strange. Funny how Lucas and you get sick around the same time. Maybe you two have the same fragile immune system. Back then, Renan had laughed. Now he felt cold. That sentence wasn't funny anymore. He checked his messages again, looking for patterns. And there they were. Late-night check-ins. Just stopping by. We need to talk. He's struggling. I promised him I'd be there. Renan realized those messages weren't about support. They were excuses. To be somewhere else. With someone else. Well, he went to the clinic again this time to get confirmation from the virologist. He asked if I've only had one partner for years, but he hasn't been tested regularly. Could I have gotten it from him? The answer came gently, but firmly, yes. Especially if he had contact with someone who was in acute infection. It would explain the timing perfectly. It was like swallowing broken glass. Renan didn't scream, didn't throw anything. He just nodded. Tears didn't even come, because what he needed now was not sadness. It was clarity. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a rupture of trust so deep it entered his bloodstream. Renan didn't want revenge. He didn't want to scream. What he wanted, what he needed, was a conversation that didn't end in silence or deflection. He wanted Hugo to look him in the eye and tell the truth. So he sent a message: I need to see you. Just us. No noise. They met at a small cafe on the corner of a quiet street. Neutral ground, familiar but not sentimental. No memories to taint, no echoes of what they once were. Hugo arrived 10 minutes late, carrying the same casual charm he always did. He smiled, as if this were just another check-in. But Renan didn't return it. He slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was the timeline report from the clinic. No commentary, just proof. Hugo opened it, skimmed the paper, then looked up. Confused at first, then cautious. Renan asked the question he had rehearsed for days. Did you sleep with Lucas while we were still together? Hugo didn't answer right away. He looked down. His fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. His breathing slowed. Then he nodded. Once, barely visible. Renan held his gaze. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just waited. Hugo spoke quietly. It wasn't planned. I went over that night. He was crying. I didn't know how to leave. It just happened. Once. But Renan didn't believe it. Not because of the act itself, but because of the way Hugo minimized it. As if cheating was something you stumbled into. As if betrayal was a spilled drink you could mop up. You didn't just cheat, Renan said, voice steady. You risked my life. You broke the only part of us I thought was safe. Hugo leaned forward, as if trying to close the distance. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just trying to help him. Lucas needed someone. He's fragile. Renan let out a soft breath. So was I. Hugo looked away. No rebuttal. No defense. Renan continued. When I got my diagnosis, you were baking dinner for him. When I sat in a cold clinic wondering how to move forward, you were choosing him again. And every time I needed you to choose me, you picked someone else. There was a silence between them. Heavy, final. Hugo whispered, I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can go to therapy. We can start over. Renan shook his head. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. And now I'm making mine. He stood up slowly, left a few bills on the table, and turned toward the door, then paused. Without turning back, he said, I hope Lucas eats well, because the man who once cooked for him won't be poisoning my heart anymore. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had happened. Cars passed, people walked. The world didn't care about what had just broken inside that cafe. But Renan did, because that conversation wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of taking his life back. Some people wait for apologies. Others wait for justice. But Renan chose something different. He chose peace, not the kind that arrives wrapped in closure, not the fairy tale version where everything makes sense, but the quiet kind, the kind you build for yourself, when the people who hurt you refuse to carry any of the weight. It took months. The routine of recovery was both cruel and kind. Daily medication, early fatigue, the occasional wave of shame he couldn't explain to anyone, but also morning walks, podcasts that made him laugh again, evenings spent with his niece drawing on the floor. Simple things, ordinary moments that reminded him he was still here. He joined a local support group not to speak, at first, just to listen. People shared their stories. Some were full of grief. Others, resilience. One man had been positive for over 20 years. He said, "This virus might live in my blood, but it doesn't own my life." That line stayed with Renan. It clung to his chest like armor. He started writing again, not about Hugo, not about betrayal, but about recovery, about boundaries, about choosing yourself when love turns into something that costs more than it gives. And slowly, people began to listen. One afternoon, Renan was invited to speak at a local community center. Small crowd, low ceiling, plastic chairs. He stood at the front of the room, holding his notes but didn't use them. Instead, he said, "When I got sick, I waited for the person I loved to show up. He didn't. And for a long time, I thought that meant I didn't matter. But the truth is, you don't need someone to hold your hand to know that you're worth saving. Sometimes you have to hold your own." The room was quiet. No one clapped. Not out of disrespect, but because everyone was sitting with what they had just heard, letting it sink in. When the session ended, people came up to thank him. A mother, a teenager, an old man with trembling hands. But one person stood apart. A nurse, maybe in his late 30s, leaned against the wall near the door. Familiar face, kind eyes. Renan recognized him instantly. He had been there on his first visit to the clinic. Not the doctor, just the one who brought him water and said quietly, "You're going to be okay." Now, months later, they stood face to face again. He smiled, then said, "You told your story well. If you ever want to have coffee with someone who listens, I'm around." Renan didn't answer right away. He didn't need to, because this time, the universe wasn't pushing him toward anything. It was simply opening a door, and Renan was finally ready to walk through it. Not all stories end with revenge. Some end with a man choosing to stop asking for love from someone who had no idea how to give it. His name is Renan, and what he found wasn't a new relationship, but a new respect for himself. Have you ever stayed too long in a place that stopped holding space for you? Let us know in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. Don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories for more stories of loss, courage, and quiet victories. Because healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it simply looks like walking away and never turning back.